Hello, everyone, and welcome back. In today's lesson, we are going to focus on shaping, one of the most fundamental teaching procedures in applied behavior analysis. Shaping is especially important because it shows us how new behavior can be built gradually, instead of expecting a learner to perform the final response all at once. This makes shaping highly relevant both in clinical practice and in BCBA exam preparation. In this presentation, we will look at what shaping is, how it works, what kinds of behavior can be shaped, and how it often appears in exam-style questions. Here is the roadmap for today's lesson. First, we will define shaping and look at the learning principle behind it. Then, we will discuss successive approximations and differential reinforcement, which are the key mechanisms that make shaping possible. After that, we will examine the different dimensions of behavior that can be shaped, including rate, timing, intensity, and topography. Finally, we will look at practical applications, common mistakes, and a few BCBA exam strategies to help you recognize shaping more confidently. Shaping is a differential reinforcement procedure used to teach new behavior by reinforcing responses that are progressively closer to a target behavior. In other words, we do not wait for the final behavior to appear perfectly from the start. Instead, we reinforce smaller steps in the right direction. These smaller steps are called successive approximations. This is what makes shaping so powerful. It allows behavior analysts to build new responses gradually, systematically, and effectively. In ABA, shaping is especially useful when the final skill is not yet in the learner's repertoire. For example, a child may not yet be able to say a full word, imitate a complex action, or engage in a complete social initiation. Shaping gives us a way to begin with whatever behavior is already present and then move step by step toward the final goal. This is why shaping is common in early intervention, language development, motor training, communication teaching, and social skills instruction. So shaping is not just a theory term. It is a practical teaching method used to develop new and increasingly complex skills. The shaping process can be understood as a sequence of clear teaching decisions. First, we define the terminal behavior, which is the final response we want the learner to achieve. That response should be observable, measurable, and socially meaningful. Second, we identify a starting point, which means the learner's current behavior that is closest to the target. Third, we reinforce that approximation consistently. Then, once it becomes stable, we shift reinforcement to a slightly closer approximation. This process continues until the final target behavior is reached. The phrase successive approximations refers to the intermediate steps that gradually move the learner toward the final target behavior. Each step should be small enough for the learner to succeed, but meaningful enough to represent real progress. That balance is very important. If the steps are too large, the learner may fail repeatedly and lose motivation. If the steps are too small, progress may become unnecessarily slow. In effective shaping, each approximation is reinforced until it occurs reliably. Only then is the criterion raised. At the heart of shaping is differential reinforcement. This means reinforcement is delivered selectively, not equally, across all responses. Behaviors that are closer to the target are reinforced. Earlier or less accurate forms are no longer reinforced in the same way or may not be reinforced at all. In this way, reinforcement acts like a guide. It tells the learner which responses are moving in the right direction. So if shaping is the overall procedure, differential reinforcement is the mechanism that drives the change. One reason shaping is such a flexible procedure is that it can be applied to multiple dimensions of behavior. We are not limited to changing only what a behavior looks like. We can shape frequency, which means how often a behavior occurs. We can shape duration, which means how long it lasts. We can shape latency, which means how quickly it begins after a cue. We can also shape intensity, meaning the strength of the response, and topography, meaning the physical form of the behavior. So shaping can change both the form of behavior and the way that behavior is performed. When shaping response rate, the goal is to increase how often a behavior occurs. For example, a learner may currently vocalize only a few times, but the long-term goal may be a much higher rate of communication attempts. In that case, we might first reinforce any increase above baseline. Once that higher rate becomes stable, reinforcement shifts to an even higher response rate. Over time, the learner meets progressively more demanding criteria. The important point is that we do not expect the final rate immediately. We build it gradually, step by step. Shaping can also target timing-related dimensions, especially duration and latency. If the goal is to increase duration, we reinforce longer periods of a behavior. For example, a learner may be reinforced for maintaining attention, eye contact, or task engagement for longer and longer periods. If the goal is to reduce latency, we reinforce quicker responding. That might mean starting a task sooner after an instruction is delivered. In both cases, the basic form of the behavior may stay similar, but the timing changes. So not all shaping is about appearance. Sometimes the goal is to change when behavior occurs or how long it lasts. Shaping can also be used to increase intensity or complexity. Intensity refers to the force, effort, or strength of a response. For example, a therapist may reinforce progressively firmer hand grasps until the desired strength is reached. Complexity is slightly different. It refers to a behavior becoming more elaborate, coordinated, or advanced over time. A learner may move from a simple action to a more precise or sophisticated version of that action. On the BCBA exam, this often appears in examples where behavior becomes stronger, more refined, or more advanced through reinforcement. Shaping within topography means the learner is still producing the same general kind of response, but the quality of that response improves over time. In other words, the topography stays mostly the same, while the response becomes more accurate, clear, or precise. A common example is speech articulation. A learner may already produce a rough version of a sound, and reinforcement is then used to strengthen increasingly accurate pronunciations. So the overall response form remains similar, but the quality of that form improves gradually. This type of shaping is useful when a learner already has a rough version of the target behavior. Shaping across topographies is different because the actual form of the response changes across steps. Each approximation is a different behavior, but each one is still closer to the final target. For example, a learner may move from babbling to saying ma and eventually to saying mom. Those are not just better versions of one exact same response. They are distinct response forms that progressively approach the goal. This type of shaping is especially helpful when the learner does not yet have a recognizable version of the target behavior. Shaping appears in many practical ABA settings. In speech development, we may reinforce early sounds before expecting full words. In motor skill training, we may reinforce reaching, then grasping, and later more precise manipulation. In social behavior, we might begin with brief orientation toward another person, then reinforce eye contact, then simple initiations, and eventually fuller interaction. In communication training, we may start by reinforcing any communicative attempt and later require clearer, more independent, or more functional communication. These examples show that shaping is highly flexible and broadly useful in practice. Although shaping is very useful, it is not always easy to implement well. One limitation is that progress can stall if the criteria are raised too quickly. When the learner cannot contact reinforcement often enough, responding may weaken. Another issue is that shaping can become slow if the approximations are poorly planned or if the reinforcers are not strong enough. Delayed reinforcement can also weaken the connection between the behavior and the consequence. And if there are too many unclear steps, the learner may become frustrated or disengaged. So shaping is powerful, but it requires careful pacing and good teaching judgment. There are several common shaping mistakes that appear both in practice and in exam questions. One is skipping approximations. If intermediate steps are missing, the learner may not have a stable path to the final behavior. Another mistake is raising criteria too quickly. That often causes responding to drop before the new approximation is well established. A third mistake is reinforcing the wrong responses, which may accidentally strengthen behavior that is not actually moving toward the target. And finally, inconsistent timing weakens the contingency between behavior and reinforcement. A classic exam trap is moving to the next step too early. To implement shaping effectively, start by clearly defining the terminal behavior. It must be observable and measurable, not vague or abstract. Next, identify a starting approximation that the learner can already perform. Then, reinforce each step reliably and immediately so the learner can discriminate which responses are successful. As progress becomes stable, increase the criterion gradually. Good shaping is not random. It is structured, responsive, and often data-based. The practitioner watches the learner's performance and adjusts the next approximation accordingly. A very important distinction for BCBA learners is the difference between shaping and chaining. Shaping is used to build new behavior by reinforcing closer and closer approximations. Chaining is different. Chaining is used to link together existing behaviors into a sequence. For example, if a learner already knows the individual steps of hand washing but needs help performing them in order, that is a chaining problem. But if the learner does not yet have a particular response form at all, and we are building that response gradually, that is shaping. So shaping changes behavior form or quality, while chaining organizes known responses into a functional sequence. To summarize, shaping is a core ABA procedure for teaching new behavior through successive approximations and differential reinforcement. It is especially useful when the final target response does not yet exist in the learner's repertoire. Shaping can be applied to many dimensions of behavior, including rate, timing, intensity, and topography. It can happen within the same general response form or across different response forms. At the same time, effective shaping requires careful planning. We need clear targets, appropriate approximations, accurate reinforcement, and gradual shifts in criteria. If you remember that shaping means reinforcing increasingly closer steps toward a final response, you already understand its central logic. That brings us to the end of this lesson on shaping. This concept is foundational because it connects theory, procedure, and application in a very direct way. It helps explain how entirely new behavior can emerge through carefully arranged reinforcement. For BCBA exam preparation, make sure you can identify the target behavior, the successive approximations, and the role of differential reinforcement in moving behavior forward. Also be ready to distinguish shaping from related concepts such as prompting and chaining. Thank you for joining me for this lesson. Keep reviewing these core ABA principles because strong conceptual understanding will improve both clinical reasoning and exam performance.